What would you do if the hedges you spent a decade caring for were hacked down overnight by your own HOA for one man? The answer wasn't words, but concrete block by block. The sound of the morning was different that day, not because of the birds or the traffic rolling along the main road a few blocks over, but because of the silence on Terrence Holt's property. He had grown used to the soft barrier of his hedges, tall and dense enough to mute the neighborhood and carve out a private pocket for himself. But when he stepped onto his porch that morning, coffee still warm in his hand, the air felt wide open in a way that made his stomach twist. He froze at the sight in front of him. The line of hedges that had taken him nearly 10 years to shape, water, and nurture stood hacked to pieces. They weren't trimmed. They were butchered. Stumps leaned jaggedly from the soil like broken teeth, leaving his yard naked to the street. Terrence's hand trembled around his mug, his safe space, the one thing he had always controlled. It had been violated. Who would do this? He muttered under his breath, his voice cracking with disbelief. The neighborhood looked ordinary enough. Sprinklers hissing across lawns, a jogger passing by with them whispered his deeds. Earbuds in a delivery truck pulling to the curb. Nobody seemed to notice that his backyard sanctuary had been destroyed overnight. But for Terrence, it wasn't just landscaping. It was personal. He set his mug down on the porch railing, stormed down the steps, and walked the line of stumps. He ran his hand across one of the cut branches. The fresh wood still damp. Whoever had done this hadn't even bothered to clean up the clippings. Bits of leaves and branches littered his grass, like some careless vandal had made a statement and walked away. Anger rose in his chest, but so did confusion. No notice, no letter, no warning. He paid his dues like everyone else. He kept his property neat, never parked on the street, never let trash cans sit out. Terrence had never been the type to pick fights or break rules, so why target him? A voice called from the sidewalk. Terrence, you see what happened? It was his neighbor, Raymond Briggs, a retired firefighter who lived across the street. The older man shaded his eyes with one hand and gave a slow shake of his head. They got to you two. Huh, Terrence straightened. What do you mean? You know who did this? Raymond hesitated, then walked over, his sneakers crunching across the driveway gravel. He lowered his voice as if the hedges themselves might still be listening. Deborah Klein, she's been on a tear lately, said. Your hedges were over 6 feet, said she warned you. Terrence's jaw dropped. Warned me. I never got a single letter, Raymond shrugged. That's her style. She doesn't always bother with paperwork. She thinks she's the law around here. Terrence clenched his fists. Deborah Klein, the HOA board member with the clipboard, the one who walked the neighborhood like a sheriff patrolling a one-horse town. He'd seen her pointing at mailboxes, taking photos of trash bins, reminding people about lawn height, but cutting down someone's property without notice. That wasn't oversight, that was trespassing. The pit in his stomach grew heavier. He felt exposed, standing there in his yard, the street wide open to his back patio. It wasn't just about plants. Someone had crossed his line. Raymond said Joe sighed and leaned on his cane. I hate to say it, Terrence, but if you push back, she'll make your life harder. She's already threatened to find people for wind chimes. Can you believe that? Wind chimes? Terrence shook his head, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't a man who lost control. Years working as an electrician had taught him patience, how to deal with setbacks, how to handle pressure, but this wasn't work. This was his home. I'm not letting this slide, he said. Finally, Raymond gave a sympathetic nod. Just be careful how you play it. She knows the rule book better than anyone. Terrence turned back toward Chio, back toward the wreckage, his mind already spinning. He could march straight to her door, but what would that solve? She does a thing. You didn't just cut down hedges, you cut down trust, and when you lose that in a neighborhood, it doesn't come back easily without waiting for her reply. Terrence walked down the path and back to the street. The time he reached his block, word had already spread. A neighbor 2 houses down waved in, him over. Hey, Terrence, heard you gave Klein a piece of your mind, the man said with a grin. About time someone did. Another, a woman pushing a stroller, slowed and whispered, good for you, she's been terrorizing people for years. Their encouragement gave Terrence a spark of resolve. He realized he wasn't alone. People had been tolerating Deborah's behavior, not agreeing with it. The hedge incident had simply been the breaking point. That evening, Terrence sat on his back porch, staring at the bare line where his green wall used to be. The silence felt heavier. Now the openness uncomfortable, but beneath that, Van. Discomfort a plan kept tugging at him. If Deborah thought she could strip away his privacy. Maybe it was time to build something she couldn't touch. His phone buzzed with a text from Raymond. "You holding up," Terrence replied with a short message. "I've got an idea. She won't like it." But before he could do the lift the first blocker, mix the first batch of mortar, he knew the entire neighborhood would be watching, and every choice he made from here on would echo louder than Deborah's clippers ever had that night. Terrence hardly slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, replaying the image of the ceiling. Mutilated hedges over and over. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Deborah's smug expression, heard her rehearsed lines about uniformity and community standards. His chest tightened with frustration. By 3 Tisley, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him, scribbling options like a man drafting battle plans. File a formal complaint, sure, but Deborah sat on the board, and she'd twist the rules to shield herself, call a lawyer possible, but expensive and lawsuits dragged on for months replaced the hedges. Why give her the satisfaction of cutting them again? He drew a line through each. Option, then tapped the pen against the pad. What he needed was something undeniable, something permanent, something that said, "This is mine and you don't get to touch it." That's when the ideas settled in his chest with weight and clarity. A wall, not hedges, not wood fencing, but cinder blocks, solid, immovable, immovable. Uncuttable, it would mark his boundary in a way no one could ignore. By morning, he felt calmer, determined. He brewed coffee, pulled on a sweatshirt, and sat on his porch staring at the stumps once more. The idea wasn't just about replacing what he'd lost. It was about reclaiming his voice. Deborah had chosen to make a spectacle out of his yard. Now he would turn it into a statement. Raymond stopped by mid-morning, leaning on his cane. "You look like a man with a plan," he said. Terrence cracked a small smile. "You could say that you gonna replant." "No," Terrence replied. "I'm building a wall." Raymond's eyebrows shot up. "A wall like brick cinder blocks," Terrence said firmly, 6 feet tall. "She can cut hedges, but she can't cut concrete." Raymond whistled low. "That'll rattle her, that's the point." Terrence said, "This isn't about landscaping anymore. This is about drawing a line. She can't cross." The older man chuckled. "Well, if you need a hand, I can't lift much these days, but I can sure keep you company." That afternoon, Terrence drove to a construction supply yard on the edge of town. The rows of stacked blocks stretched higher than his head. He loaded the bed of his pickup with as many as it could carry along, with bags of mortar and a wood. New trowel. The cashier raised an eyebrow as he rang up the purchase building. Something big. Terrence gave a half smile. You could say it's long overdue. When he pulled back into the neighborhood, the truck bed rattled with concrete heads turned. A couple mowing their lawn. Paused to watch him unload. Kids on riding scooters slowed down, curious. By the time he had the first few stacks neatly arranged in his driveway, Raymond had already shuffled over to sit in a lawn chair, cane resting across his knees. "You sure know how to get the neighborhood talking," Raymond said with a grin. "Let them talk," Terrence replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm tired of letting her decide how this place runs." As evening set in, he stood in his yard. Staring at the materials, he could almost see the wall in his mind, straight, solid, stretching the length of his property line. It wouldn't be quick work, but each block laid would be a step toward reclaiming control. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of the stacked blocks, sending it to his sister with a caption, "Time to build something that lasts." Her reply came fast. "Proud of you. Don't let her push you around." The next morning, as he mixed the first batch of mortar, Deborah's car rolled past slowly. She didn't stop, but she stared, her lips tight, eyes narrowing at the sight of him kneeling. With a trowel in hand, Terrence caught her gaze, held it for a beat, then went right back to work without saying a word. It was a silent declaration, but one loud enough for the entire street to hear. But the wall was only the beginning, because as Terrence worked, the neighborhood began to divide, and every block he laid seemed to pull people into taking sides. Saturday morning arrived with a clear sky, kind of day neighbors usually spent trimming lawns or grilling in backyards. But Terrence wasn't trimming grass or setting up a barbecue. He was out front in old work, jeans, gloves on his hands, Aze's hands. Wheelbarrow full of mortar at his side, a string line stretched along the property line where the hedges had once stood, marking where the first row of blocks would go. He crouched down, shovel scraping as he spread mortar on the ground, one block then another carefully leveled, each clink of concrete. Landing in place felt like a heartbeat, steady, determined by the time the sun was high. People had begun to notice Mrs. Chen from next door paused her gardening to watch morning Terrence. She called morning, he said, straightening his back. She tilted her head, curiosity plain in her voice. That's a lot of faux. Block's Terrence wiped his forehead. It's going to be a wall. Her eyebrows rose, a real one, real as it gets, he said. She hesitated as if debating whether to approve or criticize, then finally just smiled politely. Well, I hope it brings you some peace. Not long after Raymond showed up with 2 folding chairs and a cooler of iced tea, he settled down on the lawn like it was entertainment. You've got quite the audience already, he chuckled, nodding toward the street where 2 teens slowed their bikes to watch. To watch Terrence smirked better than cable by noon. A small crowd of curious glances and hushed conversation swirled around the project. Every neighbor walking their dog or pushing a stroller slowed their pace. Some smiled in quiet support, others frowned light. The wall was already casting a shadow across the whole street. The first row went smooth. The second row tested his patience, keeping everything level of the Joe's way. Hummer wasn't easy and his arms burned from hauling heavy blocks, but he pushed through, sweat dripping into his eyes. Each block felt like more than just material. It was defiance, set in stone around 3 in the afternoon. He heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against pavement. He didn't even need to look up. He knew Deborah Klein. She stopped at the curbans, clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the growing structure. Mr. Holt, she called. Terrence didn't look up. He spread another layer of mortar and placed another block. Mr. Holt, she repeated, sharper this time. Finally, he met her gaze. Something dewy, something bees, something. You need Deborah. She glanced at the wall, then back at him. Do you really think this fortress is appropriate for our community? Terrence leaned on his trowel. I think it's more appropriate than someone cutting down another person's property without permission. Her jaw tightened a doer, creating an eyesore. This isn't in harmony with the neighborhood's aesthetic, Terrence chuckled under his breath. Funny you didn't care about harmony when you had my hedges hacked apart. Her cheeks flushed. The board will not tolerate hostile actions. If you continue this hostile, Terrence interrupted, his voice calm but steady. Building a wall on my own property is hostile, but cutting down my plants wasn't. You really should listen to yourself. A couple of neighbors nearby pretending to water their lawns glanced toward the exchange. Deborah noticed them watching and immediately dropped her voice, softening her tone. Terrence, I'm asking you as a neighbor, stop this before it gets out of hand. He met her eyes without flinching. You had your say when you cut my hedges. This is my say, and I'm not stopping for the first time. Deborah didn't fire back immediately. She stood there, lips pressed thin, then finally spun on her heel and walked briskly down the street. Raymond laughed from his chair. That woman's going to lose her mind watching this wall go up. Terrence wiped his hands on his jeans. Good. Maybe now she'll think twice before touching what isn't hers. By sunset, the wall was already knee-high. Stretching halfway along the property line, his muscles ached, his back screamed. But seeing it rise block by block gave him a satisfaction no hedge could match. As he packed up for the day, a neighbor from 2 doors down stopped by. Looks solid, Terrence. I've been wanting to stand up to her for years. Glad somebody finally, as Terrence gave a tired, smelly appreciate it. But this isn't just about her. It's about making sure nobody thinks they can cross me again. The neighbor nodded and walked off, leaving Terrence alone with the structure. He stood there for a long while, hands on his hips, watching the wall catch the last light of the evening. It wasn't finished yet, but already it felt like a boundary. No one could ignore, but as the wall grew taller, so did the tension, and soon Deborah would find a new way to strike back, one that threatened to escalate the conflict. By in blocks and mortar, by the second weekend, Terrence's wall had grown tall enough to make passing drivers slow down. The concrete rose in clean lines, row after row, and the message was clear. This is clear. This wasn't a project, this was a statement. Neighbors were no longer just peeking out from behind curtains, they were openly talking about it now. On Saturday morning, when Terrence was mixing mortar in his wheelbarrow, 2 women stopped while walking their dogs. One of them, Mrs. Alvarez, smiled warmly. Terrence, then Mrs. Alvarez smiled warmly. Terrence, that looks some strong, good for you. Honestly, she's been out of control for years, the other woman less enthusiastic. Frowned, but a wall, don't you think it makes the street feel divided, Terrence? Set down his trowel. Divided. It's not about division, it's about respect. She tore down what was mine without asking. This wall is my answer to that. The first woman nodded. The second gave a tight smile, muttered a polite goodbye, and walked off. That was the pattern support, mixed with unease. Some people admired his determination. Others whispered that he was escalating either way. No one ignored it. Raymond he sat in his lawn chair like a commentator, sipping ice to throwing out one-liners every block you lay. Terrence, you're laying down the law. Terrence would laugh, but deep down, he knew Raymond was right. The wall was more than concrete. It was authority made visible. By midday, the chatter reached a new pitch when a small group of neighbors gathered across the street. Terrence could hear snippets of their debate. Looks awful. One man muttered like, we live in a prison yard. Another voice countered, no, it looks like someone finally stood up to Deborah. She's been nitpicking us for years. Then a third voice, quieter, what if she finds him? That HOA can make life miserable. If they wanted, Terrence kept working, pretending not to hear. But every word sank in. People were choosing sides, and the wall had become more than his personal project. It was turning into a neighborhood referendum on Deborah's power. Evening, as he cleaned up his tools, Mrs. Chen stopped by with a container of dumplings. You must be starving working like you. That all day, she said kindly. Terrence smiled gratefully. You didn't have to thank you. She hesitated, her voice lowering. I admire what you're doing, but be careful, Deborah. She doesn't like losing. Terrence chuckled softly. Neither do I. The next day proved her point. Early Sunday morning, while Terrence was so dead. Still tightening the line on the far end of his wall, a sleek SUV pulled up. Out stepped Mr. Granger, another Hamlike Deborah member. Unlike Deborah isn't known for patrols or clipboards, he was more the stay in the background and nod along type. Mr. Holt, he called, adjusting his tie, even though it was barely 9. Could we have a word? Terrence set down his trowel and met him at the curb. What's on your mind? Granger cleared his throat. There's been concern some residents feel the wall is excessive, not in keeping with community standards. Deborah has suggested we issue a formal notice. Terrence raised an eyebrow. Excessive cutting down a man's hedges without permission wasn't excessive. Granger shifted uncomfortably. I'm not here to debate what's already happened. I'm here to ask if you'd consider stopping before this escalates. Further, Terrence folded his arms. Tell me something, Mr. Granger. Do you think it's excessive? The man hesitated, eyes darting. Personally, I think it's your property. But Deborah doesn't own this yard. Terrence cut in. I do, and I'm not stopping for a moment. Silence hung between them. Then Granger gave a resigned nod. I'll tell her you're not budging. Terrence turned back to his work. Placing another block with deliberate care, the conversation only made his resolve stronger. Later that afternoon, more neighbors approached, this time openly voicing their feelings. I support you, Terrence said. A man named Andre from down the block, she fined me last year for leaving my trash can out for show. 3 hours enough is enough. Another neighbor. Mrs. Rowe shook her head. I don't know, the wall feels hostile. It changes the whole look of our street. Terrence wiped sweat from his brow and looked her in the eye. Hostile was waking up to find my hedges gone. This wall is peace of mind. She didn't argue. Further just sighed and walked away. By sunset, the wall stretched taller and the air in the neighborhood felt heavier. Deborah hadn't appeared that day, but her presence lingered in every whisper, every glance. Terrence stood with Raymond at the curb, looking at what they had accomplished so far. She's not going to let this go, Raymond muttered. Terrence nodded slowly. Good, neither am I. But Deborah wasn't finished. She had her own weapons, and soon she would come back swinging, pushing the fight to an entirely new level. By Monday morning, the neighborhood had shifted from casual curiosity to open tension. Terrence noticed it right away when he stepped onto his porch. 2 neighbors across the street whispered, while pointing at the wall, and a third drove by slower than usual, shaking his head. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was division you could feel in the air. And then came the letter, folded neatly into sand. His mailbox was an envelope stamped with the Tentowi logo. Inside on crisp white paper was an official notice of violation. The words jumped off the page structure, not in compliance with HOA design standards, immediate action required to cease construction or face escalating fines. Terrence read it twice, his twice, his jaw tightening. He knew immediately whose hand was behind it. Deborah Klein, he carried the letter inside, slapped it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it while the coffee maker gurgled behind him. The rules were vague deliberately, so they talked about uniform appearance and approved structures, but never specified materials or limits. It was exactly the kind of loophole Deborah thrived on. By noon, she showed up herself. Terrence was hauling another stack of blocks. When he heard the click of heels again, Deborah stood at the edge of his driveway, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Holt," she said sharply, "I trust you all. I trust you." Received the notice, Terrence set down the block, slowly straightening to face her eye. "Did your wasting paper?" Her lips brought a heat-wavy kind of sticky summer air that made most people hide inside with air conditioning. Terrence, though, was out front by 7 a.m., sweat already beading on his forehead. As he laid down the final stretch of cinder blocks, the wall was nearly done. Now it ran the full length of his property. Line standing 6 feet tall and perfectly straight, every block represented hours of work, aching muscles, and determination. But as he placed the last one in position, he felt something new: satisfaction. Raymond clapped from his lawn chair. "Look at that. You did it. That's a fortress." Terrence stepped back, hands on his hips, and studied the finished line. "It's not a fortress," he said quietly. "It's a boundary." The morning passed with a steady stream of onlookers. Some neighbors came over to shake his hand, offering congratulations. "Looks solid, Holt," said Andre, who had complained about Deborah's fines before. "That wall's got more backbone than the board itself." Others were less kind. Mrs. Rose stopped at the curb, lips pursed. "It's imposing," she said carefully. "Do you really think this helps the neighborhood's look?" Terrence gave her a patient smile. "It helps me sleep at night." "That's enough." She frowned and walked away, muttering something under her breath. By afternoon, the wall was all anyone could talk about. Kids on bikes circled around the block to gawk. A couple jogging past slowed to snap photos. Even passing delivery drivers leaned out their windows to get a better look. And of course, Deborah appeared. Deborah appeared. She arrived just before sunset, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arms, sunglasses perched on her nose. Even though the light was fading, she stood in front of the wall as if it were a personal insult carved in stone. "So this is it?" she said coldly. "Your grand statement." Terrence leaned against his shovel, sweat dripping down his temples. "It's not a statement, it's a solution. No one touches it, no one cuts it down." Her lips twisted into something between a smile and a sneer. "You think this makes you look strong. It makes you look combative. The neighbors don't want barriers, Mr. Holt. They want community. Community is built on respect," Terrence said, his voice calm but edged. "And respect doesn't mean tearing down what someone else worked for. This wall is the line you can't cross." Raymond chimed in from his chair, unable to resist. "Looks to me like you've lost Deborah. He's got more concrete in the ground than you're by it." "Laws on paper." She snapped her head toward him. "This isn't over. The board will pursue fines, will pursue legal remedies. This wall cannot stand." Terrence straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You can try, but every time you do, you'll just remind people of what you did. And every time they look at this wall, they'll remember who pushed me to build it." For once, Deborah had no immediate retort. She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, heels clattering against the pavement, her anger visible in every step that night. Terrence sat on his porch, staring at the finished wall under the glow of the street lights. It wasn't beautiful, not like the hedges had been. It was raw gray industrial, but it was honest. It stood because he had put it there with his own 2 hands, and no one could take it away. His phone buzzed again. A message from his sister. Saw the photos. "The wall looks strong. I'm proud of you, Terrence." Smiled faintly. He hadn't asked for photos to be shared, but clearly neighbors had been talking beyond the block. The wall wasn't just his anymore. It had become a symbol. For some, it was stubbornness. For others, it was courage. The next morning, when he went to collect the paper, noticed something surprising. 2 houses down, a neighbor had started putting up a wooden privacy fence across the street. Another was sketching out plans with a contractor. The ripple had begun his wall, had emboldened others. Raymond shuffled over with his cane, grinning. "Looks like you started a movement. Klein's gonna lose her mind." Terrence chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't build it to start anything. I just built it to finish something." He looked at the solid line of cinder blocks one more time. It wasn't the yard he'd planned on having, but it was his. And for the first time since the hedges had been hacked apart, he felt at peace. But peace wouldn't last. Not with Deborah plotting her next move. The wall had shifted the balance of power, and soon the entire neighborhood would be dragged into the fallout. The wall changed everything by the following week. The neighborhood felt different. It wasn't just the sight of the gray barrier running along Terrence's yard. It was the way people acted around it. Conversations quieted when he walked. Past mail carriers lingered longer at the curb, their eyes flicking between the wall and the houses around it on Tuesday evening. Terrence noticed a group gathered at the corner neighbors he usually waved to, now huddled in whispered discussion. When he approached, they went silent. A woman named Denise finally broke the pause. Terrence, she said cautiously, we respect what you're doing, but Deborah's saying the Hidio will hit you with heavy fines. She claims she's already talked to a lawyer. Terrence crossed his arms. Let her, I've got receipts, photos of those hedges before she cut them down, proof of those heavy. What she did, if she wants court, she'll have to explain why she trespassed. Denise bit her lip. She's telling people the wall is ruining property values. Some believe her, some don't. Either way, the neighborhood feels tense. Terrence gave a curt nod. Tense because of her, not because of me. By Friday, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The small clubhouse was packed wall to wall, hotter than usual, with so many people crammed inside. Deborah sat at the front table, flanked by two board members. Her clipboard rested beside her like a weapon. She cleared her throat and raised her voice. This meeting is about restoring order to our community. Mr. Holt's unauthorized wall has divided neighbors, damaged our neighborhood's character, and threatens to lower property values. This cannot stand. Murmurs filled the room. Terrence sat in the front row, hands clasped, waiting. Deborah continued. We propose daily fines until the structure is removed. If fines are ignored, the board will pursue legal action. We cannot allow one person's defiance to dictate the standards we've all agreed to uphold. Terrence rose to his feet. His voice carried steady, not shouting, but clear enough that every corner of the room heard. You want to talk about defiance? Let's talk about what started this. My hedges were cut down without notice, without permission, without respect. Not because they were harming anyone, but because one person decided she could trample over my rights. That wasn't enforcement, that was arrogance. A man in the back spoke up. He's right. Deborah fined me for having my trash bin out 2 hours late. She's been abusing her power for years. Another voice chimed in, this time Mrs. Alvarez, and she threatened me over a flower bed that she said clashed with the aesthetic. I'm tired of it. The room shifted. More voices rose, layered, overlapping. Some shouted about Deborah's overreach. Others defended her strictness, saying she kept the neighborhood tated. Thur grew heated, louder by the minute. Deborah banged her gavel. Order. But the noise swelled, drowning her out. Terrence raised his hand, and gradually the voices quieted. This war isn't about making enemies, he said firmly. It's about making boundaries. Everyone here deserves to feel safe in their own home. If the HOA can tear down what you plant, if they can step onto your lawn without consent, then none of us really owns anything here. And if you let that go unchecked, next time it'll be your bet. Yard, your flowers, your fence. A ripple of agreement swept the room. Even those who had looked skeptical earlier nodded reluctantly. Raymond, sitting in the back with his cane, added his voice. I've been here 25 years. Never seen a man stand up to her like this. It's about time. Deborah's face flushed crimson. She slammed the gavel again. You people don't understand. Without rules, there's chaos. Terrence met her glare. Rules are supposed to protect people, not strip them of their rights. What you call order looks a lot like control. The room erupted again. But this time, it wasn't chaos. It was momentum. Neighbors clapped, voices overlapping in support. Some even stood to their feet. Deborah's gavel pounded helplessly against the table. Hoo-ho. But it couldn't stop the tide. When the noise finally subsided, Mr. Granger, the quieter board member, cleared his throat. Maybe the board should reconsider how enforcement is handled. Perhaps a vote among residents instead of unilateral decisions. The suggestion drew murmurs of approval. Deborah said, Wise widened. You can't be serious, but her protest was drowned out by more applause. Terrence sat back down, his heart racing, but his face calm. For the first time since the hedges had been destroyed, he felt like the ground had shifted, not in his favor alone, but for everyone tired of being pushed around. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors surrounded him. Some shook his hand, others clapped his shoulder. Even those who had been hesitant earlier seemed to see him differently. Now Raymond grinned as they stepped outside into the cool night. She's rattled, Terrence. You didn't just build a wall. You built a wall. You built backbone for this whole neighborhood. Terrence gave a small smile, glancing back at the clubhouse where Deborah lingered, her clipboard clutched tight, but her control slipping. But victory in a meeting room wasn't the end. What came next would decide whether the neighborhood truly changed, or if Deborah would find a way to claw back her grip. The night of the meeting left Terrence drained but restless. He sat on his porch well past midnight, watching the glow of streetlights wash over the fresh wall. The air carried the faint hum of crickets, but his thoughts were louder. The fight wasn't just about hedges anymore. It was about standing firm when someone tried to steamroll you, even when they had a title or a clipboard. The next few days revealed just how much had shifted for years. Deborah's word had been law. People accepted fines without challenge, adjusted their gardens, repainted fences, anything to avoid her wrath. But after the meeting, neighbors weren't whispering anymore. They were speaking openly. Andre knocked on Terrence's door 2 days later, holding a petition. "A few of us think it's time for new board elections," he explained. "We want a process where decisions are transparent, no more backroom moves." Terrence signed without hesitation. Word spread fast. Within a week, nearly every house on the street had added their names. Deborah, of course, didn't back down easily. Flyers appeared again, this time warning that reckless actions threatened the neighborhood's unity, but fewer people listened. Some tore them mid-air. Some tore them up the moment they found them. Others laughed about it. One afternoon, Terrence was mowing his lawn when Mrs. Rowe, the one who had once called the wall hostile, stopped at the curb. She hesitated before speaking. "I wasn't sure about the wall at first," she admitted, "but I see now why you built it. It made us as luxed as once. Realize how much we'd let her control us. I guess I owe you an apology." Terrence shut off the mower and smiled. "No apology needed. Everyone's got their own way of seeing things. What matters is we start respecting each other again." Her shoulders relaxed, and she gave him a genuine smile before walking on down. That moment meant more to him than the wall itself. By the time the petition forced a vote, Deborah's grip was already slipping. The meeting hall filled again, this time with residents determined to make a change. The ballots were simple, the outcome decisive. Deborah lost her seat. Granger stepped down, perhaps realizing his silence had cost him credibility in their place. A new board was elected. Neighbors who promised to act with fairness, not fear. When the results were announced, the room erupted in applause. Deborah sat stiff in her chair, her face pale, her clipboard untouched. She stood abrupt, muttered something under her breath, and walked out. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter. Raymond shuffled over to Terrence, grinning ear to ear. "Well, you did it. You brought down the queen with nothing but mortar and grit." Terrence laughed softly. "I didn't do it alone of Rion, just needed a reason to stand up." The weeks that followed brought small but important changes. Notices were discussed openly at meetings, not slipped into mailboxes. Residents felt free to decorate their yards, plant flowers, hang wind chimes without fear of fines. The neighborhood didn't fall into chaos. As Deborah had warned, it grew closer. As for Terrence, the wall became part of the street's identity. Some still saw it as an stark. Others admired its strength, but to him it wasn't about beauty, it was about peace. Each time he sat on his porch and looked at it, he felt the calm of knowing no one could take his space from him again. One evening, his sister came to visit. She stood at the curb staring at the wall and shook her head with a smile. "I'll be honest, Terrence, I didn't think you'd go through with it. But looking at this now, I see what it means." He nodded. "It means I won't let anyone decide for me what I can or can't have on my own property. It means boundaries matter, whether it's hedges, walls, or respect." Hugged him tightly. "You taught them all something." Later that night, Terrence sat with Raymond on the porch, watching kids ride their bikes past the wall without a care. The neighborhood had found its balance again. Not perfect, but better. Raymond sipped his tea and chuckled. "Funny thing is that wall you built ended up tearing down something bigger." Her control. Terrence smiled, eyes on the concrete line glowing faintly under the streetlight. "Sometimes you've got to build something solid to remind people they can't just cut you down." The lesson lingered. Boundaries weren't just physical, they were personal. They were personal, emotional, and necessary. Standing up didn't mean shouting louder. It meant showing block by block that some lines could never be crossed. And for Terrence Holt, that wall would stand not as a monument to conflict, but as a symbol of dignity, strength, and the simple truth that enforced. If this story spoke to you, remember this: boundaries matter, whether it's your home, your time, or your peace of mind. Never be afraid to defend them. And if you enjoyed hearing Terrence's journey, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss the next story.